My name is Sarah Miller. I'm 49 years old, and for 15 years I lived in someone else's house. My father-in-law Arthur was paralyzed from the waist down after a car accident, and my husband, Daniel, his own son, took a job in Texas and left me with the bills, the bedpans, and the bad nights. His sisters started a catering company with Arthur's settlement money and called it Miller Family Catering. I was not invited. Then one Thanksgiving, I watched a power of attorney document slide across the dinner table to Elena, the woman Arthur married just 6 months after his wife's funeral. 7 years younger than me. The woman the whole neighborhood called a gold digger. My stepmother-in-law, right in front of my eyes. That night Elena walked into my kitchen at 2 in the morning. There was a foreclosure notice on the table. She looked at it and said, "Once he's gone, you're out. The sisters and I have decided." Just like that, like a fact. I looked down at my hands. 15 years of calluses. The ring I'd stopped wearing because it caught on his sheets every night. "I gave you my youth, Arthur," I whispered to the dark. "And I have nothing to show for it." But none of them knew what Arthur had been doing in that back bedroom on his good days for the past 6 months. Before we go any further, please hit subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from today. If you give this a like, good luck is coming your way. The smell of the diner hit Sarah Miller the same way it always had: burnt coffee, industrial cleaner, and something sweet underneath that she could never quite identify. Maple syrup, maybe, or just the particular warmth of a place that had been cooking the same food for 30 years without apology. It was the kind of smell that meant ordinary Tuesday mornings and church groups stopping in after service and high school kids piling into the corner booths on Friday nights. The Valley View Diner on Route 9 had been a fixed point in Millbrook, New Jersey for as long as anyone could remember, and Sarah had always found something steadying about that. Today, it was not steadying. She sat in the booth closest to the window, her coffee growing cold beside her, and watched the scene unfolding at the center of the room. With the particular stillness of someone who has learned that drawing attention to yourself is almost never worth the cost. Arthur Miller, her father-in-law, 72 years old, a retired electrician with enormous hands and a laugh that had once rattled the windows of the house on Cedar Lane, was sitting across from a woman Sarah had only met 3 times. Elena, 36 years his junior. Dark-haired, composed, wearing a yellow blouse that seemed to belong to a different season than the gray March afternoon pressing against the diner windows. They were not holding hands across the table. They were simply sitting close to each other in the uncalculated way of people who have already decided something, which was somehow worse. The ring was on Elena's finger. That was what Tiffany had spotted first. Sarah had watched her sister-in-law's face change when she saw it, that fast, involuntary shift from irritation to something colder. Something that had been waiting a long time for a surface to land on. Tiffany Vance was 52 and carried herself like a woman who believed the world owed her a settlement she had not yet collected. She had driven down from Bergen County that morning in a car that was 2 years newer than she could afford. And she had brought Brooke, because Tiffany always brought Brooke. Brooke Miller, Daniel's other sister, 47. Who worked a corporate assistant job in Parsippany and wore her resentments on her face like a second application of blush. The 4 of them, Tiffany, Brooke, Arthur, and Elena, had been speaking in low, careful voices when Sarah arrived with Daniel. But the low voices didn't last long. 6 months. Tiffany said it like a verdict. "Mom has been in the ground for 6 months and you brought her here." Elena had not flinched. That was the first thing Sarah noticed about her, that she did not flinch when Tiffany said things like that. What happened next was fast and ugly, and the kind of thing that left a stain on a room even after the noise stopped. Tiffany was out of her seat before Arthur could get a word in, and then Brooke was standing too. And there was a hand going toward Elena's arm, a grab rather than a touch, and a coffee mug going sideways, and the cook coming out from behind the counter, and 3 people at the neighboring table turning in their seats with the wide, uncomfortable eyes of witnesses who hadn't signed up to be witnesses. Sarah stood and said nothing. She watched Daniel, her husband of 23 years, a solid and careful man who managed a regional supply chain in Texas, and came home 4 times a year and called it keeping the marriage alive. She watched him sit perfectly still in the booth across from her. His hands were flat on the table. His eyes were on the surface between his hands. The way a man stares at something he has decided not to look up from. Arthur was trying to stand. Elena put her hand on his forearm and said something quiet to him, and he sat back down with the expression of a man absorbing a familiar humiliation. The kind that's been arriving in different forms for so long it no longer surprises you, only tires you. The staff got Tiffany and Brooke to the door. Someone brought napkins for the spilled coffee. The neighboring table went back to their food with the slightly too studied focus of people pretending they had seen nothing. Sarah sat back down. She picked up her own mug, which was still upright and still cold. And she held it with both hands and looked out the window at the parking lot and at the gray sky beyond it and at nothing in particular. The knot in her stomach was not new. It had been there for some time since the phone call about the wedding. Really, since the moment Daniel had said Dad married that woman in the tone of a man reporting damage rather than news. But sitting in that booth with the smell of burnt coffee around her, and the sound of her husband's deliberate silence beside her, Sarah felt the knot pull tighter in a way that was different from before. Specific, like something being measured. She had always been a woman who noticed things. It was the Tudors' instinct, years of sitting across kitchen tables from teenagers who said one thing with their mouths and another with their eyes, years of learning to read the gap between what people presented and what they meant. She noticed the way Tiffany's fury had an edge of desperation underneath the outrage. The way Brooke followed her older sister with the blind eagerness of a woman who had never learned to want things for herself. The way Elena, even in the middle of being grabbed and accused, had kept her hand on Arthur's arm, grounding him, not herself. She filed all of it away without quite knowing why. The house on Cedar Lane smelled different from the diner. It smelled like the past, like the particular density of a home that had been lived in for decades without revision, where the wood absorbed everything and gave nothing back. Sarah had spent more time in this house than she had in her own apartment in the last 2 years. There were things in the refrigerator that she had put there. There was a throw blanket on the couch that she had bought at Target on a December afternoon when the heat had gone out briefly. And Arthur had sat in the living room pretending he wasn't cold. She was washing the dishes from that morning's breakfast when she found it. It wasn't hidden, exactly. It was between the phone book and the stack of old utility bills in the drawer beside the refrigerator. The kind of drawer that accumulates everything that doesn't have an obvious home anywhere else. A statement. A retirement account statement. The name at the top said Tiffany M. Vance, and the balance line at the bottom said $0. Sarah stood very still. She read it again. The dates. The withdrawal history in the columns below, which told a story in numbers, a slow decline over 4 years and then a sudden drop. The kind that meant something had gone wrong faster than expected. A real estate deal, maybe. Or a series of them. The statement was 3 months old, and 0 was 0. She heard footsteps and turned. Elena was standing in the kitchen doorway. She had a glass of water in one hand and was watching Sarah with an expression that was not alarmed and not cold. It was something more complicated than either of those things. And Sarah felt the hair on her arms stand up slightly because she had expected accusation and received instead a kind of recognition. Elena crossed the kitchen without speaking and set the glass of water on the counter. Then she opened the cabinet above the coffee maker and took down a white plastic pill organizer. The weekly kind, with the days of the week printed on each compartment in blue letters. She placed it on the counter beside the water. Then her hands moved to the Monday compartment, and Sarah saw that they were trembling. A very fine tremor, the kind that comes not from illness but from some sustained effort of will being maintained just below the surface. Elena didn't look at her. She filled the compartments with practiced efficiency, the small pills making soft clicking sounds against the plastic. Sarah looked down at the statement still in her hand. Then she put it back in the drawer, and closed the drawer, and turned back to the dishes. The silence in the kitchen was not comfortable, but it was not hostile. It was something else, 2 women standing in a room full of things. Neither of them had chosen, performing the tasks that kept the machinery of the house running, and both of them aware that the machinery was more fragile than it looked. Sarah thought about the scene at the diner. About Tiffany's hand on Elena's arm. About Daniel's hands flat on the table, motionless, saying nothing. She thought about the 0 on the statement. She thought about Elena's trembling hands, and about the way Elena had touched Arthur's forearm in the booth, not possessively, but with the particular gentleness of someone who has decided to protect something regardless of what it costs them. From the living room came the sound of the television, some afternoon news program Arthur had turned on after they came home. The anchors spoke in the measured tones of people delivering ordinary catastrophes. Outside the kitchen window, the bare March trees moved in a wind that had been cold all week and showed no intention of changing. Sarah dried her hands on the dish towel hanging from the oven handle. She folded it back into thirds the way she always did. A small habit from years of small habits in this kitchen, in this house. In this family that was not quite hers. Is this the man I married, she thought, thinking of Daniel in that booth. Or just a stranger in a suit who happens to use my last name? She didn't answer the question. She wasn't ready to, yet. But the knot in her stomach had a shape now, where before it had only been weight. And somehow, that was worse. 5 years passed the way difficult years do, not in a rush, but in a slow accumulation of small surrenders. Each one reasonable enough on its own, each one adding its weight to a load that Sarah had stopped measuring because measuring it would have meant admitting how heavy it had become. The morning of Arthur's accident was a Tuesday in late October, the kind of New Jersey fall day that arrives with a particular quality of light pale gold, thin, the sky. A high clear blue that made everything look like it was being seen through glass. Sarah had been in her own kitchen in Hoboken, correcting a stack of practice SAT essays for a junior she tutored on Wednesday afternoons, when the phone rang. Alina's voice on the other end was very controlled. That was the first thing Sarah noticed. Not the words themselves, something about the car, the intersection, the hospital in Morristown. But the particular control in Alina's voice, the effort behind it, the way a person sounds when they have decided that falling apart is not something they can afford to do right now. Arthur had gone out to pick up Alina's prescription from the CVS on Millbrook Avenue. It was a 12-minute round trip on a good day. He had made it 100 times. The delivery truck that ran the light on Oak Street did not see the Buick until it was too late. And the Buick did not have the kind of modern safety systems that might have made a difference, and Arthur Miller, 73 years old, retired electrician, was taken by ambulance to Morristown Medical Center with 2 fractured vertebrae in his lower spine. He would not walk again. The surgeon used the word permanent, and he used it carefully. The way doctors learn to use words that will live in the rooms of people's lives long after the appointment is over. Tiffany arrived at the hospital before Sarah did. This was notable primarily because Tiffany lived 40 minutes farther away, which meant she had been driving fast, which meant she had needed to be there first for reasons that had nothing to do with her father's comfort. She was in the hallway outside the ICU when Sarah came off the elevator, and her face had already arranged itself into the expression Sarah would come to know well over the following months, that particular set of the jaw that meant Tiffany was calculating something. Divine punishment, she said to Brooke, not quietly, in the hospital corridor with other families 10 feet away in chairs. I said from the beginning that marriage was going to destroy him. She sent him out for her own errands. Her errands. Elena was sitting alone at the end of the corridor, her coat still on, her hands folded in her lap. She did not look up when Tiffany said it. Sarah sat down beside her. She didn't say anything. After a moment, Elena said, his blood pressure medication. He was going to pick up my blood pressure medication. And then she stopped, because she had said everything there was to say, and saying it again would not change the weight of it. The bills started arriving within 2 weeks. Sarah had managed household finances before her own, Daniel's, the shared accounts they maintained across the distance of Texas and New Jersey. But nothing had prepared her for the particular bureaucratic density of Medicare billing. The explanation of benefits forms arrived in envelopes with CMS printed in the corner. And each one was a small maze of approved amounts and non-covered charges and provider adjustments that seemed designed to exhaust the person reading it before they reached the number that actually mattered. She spread them on the kitchen table on a Thursday evening, 6 weeks after the accident, and read them with the focused patience she brought to everything that required focused patience. The denied claims were marked in red. There were more red marks than she had expected. Skilled nursing coverage denied after 20 days. Physical therapy extension denied pending appeal. Home modification assessment denied, not considered medically necessary. Sarah set the last page down and sat very still for a long moment. The number she was looking at, the gap between what Medicare would cover and what Arthur's ongoing care would actually cost, was not a number she could fix by being careful with the grocery budget. She was still sitting at that table when Daniel called at 9:30. "How bad is it?" he asked. "It's significant," Sarah said. "The PT alone is going to cost." "I talked to Tiffany today," Daniel said, and something in his voice had a rehearsed quality, the tone of a man working through something he has prepared. "She thinks, and I think she's probably right, that the most practical arrangement would be for Dad to have consistent, dedicated care. Someone there full-time, or close to full-time." Sarah waited. "You work from home," Daniel said. "Your tutoring schedule is flexible." "Daniel, I know it's a lot to ask. But you're already there more than anyone else, and the alternative is a facility, and he doesn't want a facility, he was very clear about." "What about you?" Sarah asked. The question came out very level, which cost her something. A pause. "There's a regional manager position opening in Austin. We've been talking about it for a few months. The timing is it's not ideal, I know that. But it's a significant opportunity, and the company won't hold it." "You're really leaving me here with a dying man and a woman you hate?" Sarah heard herself say the words and felt them land differently than she had expected, not like accusation but like something factual, like a diagnosis. Daniel was quiet for a moment. "I don't hate Elena," he said finally. "I just don't trust her. Tiffany hates Elena. Tiffany is handling a lot right now. We are all handling a lot right now, Daniel." But she could already hear in the quality of his silence that the decision had been made before the call. And the call was not a conversation but an announcement dressed up as one. She had learned to recognize the difference over 23 years. He promised to send money monthly. He used words like contribution and temporary arrangement and reassess in 6 months, which was the language of a man building himself an exit. He flew to Austin 3 weeks later. Sarah drove him to Newark Airport in the gray November rain. And they hugged in the departure lane with the efficient brevity of people who have run out of things to say that won't cost too much. She watched him go through the sliding glass doors and disappear into the terminal. She sat in the car for a while before she drove back. The sound of his suitcase zipper in the hotel room the night before, that bright mechanical finality, stayed with her for a long time afterward. It had sounded, she thought, like something locking. Not a suitcase. Something else. Something that would take much longer than a flight to Texas to open again. Back at Cedar Lane, the days took on their new shape. Arthur needed turning in the night. He needed his medications at specific hours. He needed the particular vigilance of someone who could read the difference between a good day and a day that was heading somewhere worse. Who knew when to call the visiting nurse and when to simply sit with him and let the television fill the room with sound. Sarah learned these things the way she learned everything, by paying attention, by being present, by making herself useful in ways that nobody explicitly thanked her for, because over time, the useful person becomes part of the furniture, expected rather than appreciated. Elena was there. This was the reality that Sarah had not fully anticipated. She had expected, in some quiet part of herself, that Elena might leave, that the accident might dissolve whatever it was that had drawn a woman of 42 to a man of 72, that the weight of what the future now looked like might prove heavier than the attachment. But Elena did not leave. She cooked. She handled the insurance calls with a methodical patience that surprised Sarah. She changed the sheets and administered the evening medications and sat beside Arthur's bed in the wing-backed chair. She had moved from the living room, reading aloud from the Louis L'Amour westerns Arthur had loved since he was a young man. Sarah watched all of this from the edges, and she was not sure what to make of it. And so she filed it alongside everything else she was not yet ready to interpret. What she knew for certain was the number on the Medicare EOB. What she knew was that Daniel was in Austin and the money arrived sporadically and in amounts smaller than the promised figure. What she knew was that the house on Cedar Lane creaked in the winter wind and the furnace was old and Arthur's care was costing more than anyone had budgeted for. She opened a new savings account and began depositing the tutoring money she made above her household expenses. The amounts were small. She deposited them anyway. It was the only thing she could think to do that belonged entirely to her. Outside, November became December. The trees on Cedar Lane stood bare against a sky that had gone the color of old pewter. And the cold that came in under the back door was the kind that settled into the bones of an old house and did not leave until March, if it left then at all. Sarah put a towel against the base of the door. Then she made Arthur his dinner, and brought Elena a plate without being asked, and sat alone at the kitchen table. When they had both eaten, and looked at the phone on the counter, and did not call Daniel. Some silences, she was learning, said more than the conversations that replaced them. The alliance happened the way most betrayals do, gradually, and then all at once, and in a way that seemed, looking back, almost inevitable. It started with the catering business. Or rather, it started with Tiffany, who had a talent for identifying resources other people had overlooked and a complete absence of embarrassment about exploiting them. The idea, as she presented it to Arthur during one of her increasingly frequent visits to Cedar Lane in the spring after the accident, was simple. Arthur had received a modest insurance settlement from the delivery company, not the life-changing figure a lawyer might have promised, but a real sum, enough to matter, and it was, in Tiffany's framing, simply sitting there, doing nothing. "Dad, you have an asset," she told him, perched on the edge of the couch in the living room. With the posture of a woman presenting a business proposal rather than visiting her injured father. "Elena knows food service. I know real estate and client relations. Brooke has administrative experience. We turn the settlement into startup capital, we build something, and you have an income stream that isn't Social Security." Arthur had looked at Elena, who was standing in the kitchen doorway with a dish towel in her hands and an expression Sarah could not read from where she stood at the top of the stairs. After a moment, Elena had nodded. Sarah, hearing this from upstairs where she had been changing the linens, had stood very still and thought about the zero on Tiffany's 401k statement, which she had not forgotten. The business launched that summer under the name Miller Family Catering, which Sarah thought was a particular kind of audacity since she, the only Miller actually living in the house and performing the actual labor of keeping the family's patriarch alive, had not been invited to be part of it. Not that she would have joined. But the word family carried a specific sting in that context, a small mean joke that nobody acknowledged as a joke. Tiffany handled the marketing and the client acquisition. Brooke managed the calendar and the invoicing, doing it poorly and blaming the software. Elena cooked, because Elena could actually cook. This turned out to be genuinely true. And Sarah filed it away as one of the facts about Elena that didn't fit the story Tiffany was telling about her. Sarah took care of Arthur. This was not discussed at the business launch meeting, which happened in the dining room on a Saturday afternoon in June. While Arthur napped in the bedroom and Sarah sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea and the awareness of being invisible. It was simply assumed, the way certain things are assumed about certain people once a pattern has been established long enough to calcify into expectation. She cleaned the bathrooms and managed Arthur's medication schedule and did the laundry and drove to the pharmacy on Route 9 and called the insurance company. When a claim was denied, and sat with Arthur on the bad nights when his pain was high and his medication had not yet reached the level that gave him relief. She did all of this without anyone saying thank you or acknowledging that it was being done, because she had become part of the house's operation in the way that good plumbing is part of a house's operation, noticed only when it failed. The Thanksgiving dinner was Tiffany's idea, and in retrospect Sarah should have recognized it for what it was, a staging ground. The dining room table had been extended with the leaf Arthur kept in the garage, and Elena had cooked for 2 days. And the house smelled extraordinary roasted bird and sage stuffing and the particular sweetness of the candied yams that Arthur had requested specifically, the ones his wife had made every year, from a recipe Sarah had been the one to transcribe from the handwritten index card in the kitchen drawer and give to Elena the previous spring. Sarah had been in the kitchen since 7 that morning. She had helped with the prep, peeled more potatoes than she could count, checked Arthur's blood pressure twice, and changed his bed linens when he'd had a difficult night. By the time the table was set and the guests, Tiffany and her husband, Brooke with her teenage son, and 2 business clients Tiffany had somehow annexed into a family holiday, were seated in the dining room. Sarah had not sat down since breakfast. She was cutting Arthur's food in the back bedroom when she heard the toast. Tiffany's voice carried easily through the old walls of the house. She was a woman who had never learned to modulate her volume in spaces that didn't require it. To Miller Family Catering, and to our expansion next year, and to the people who made it possible. Glasses clinked. Arthur shifted in his bed, and Sarah brought the fork to his mouth. And he ate with the careful patience of a man who had learned to make peace with being dependent on someone else's hands. She went back to the kitchen for his glass of water and passed close to the dining room doorway, close enough to hear Brooke's voice, lower than Tiffany's but deliberately carrying the tone of a woman making sure she was overheard by a specific person. "Look at those hands," Brooke said. "You know she used to be pretty? Before all this. Now she looks like the unpaid help." Laughter, briefly, quickly covered. Sarah stopped walking. She stood in the hallway outside the kitchen for a moment, holding Arthur's water glass, and looked down at her hands. Brooke was not wrong about the calluses. They had appeared gradually over the years from the grip of the shower chair, from the transfers. From the particular physical work of moving a man who could not move himself. She had stopped thinking of them as something to notice. She went back to the bedroom. She set the glass on the bedside table and sat in the chair beside Arthur's bed, and through the wall. She could hear the rise and fall of the Thanksgiving celebration, the business talk and the self-congratulation and the clinking of glasses over the turkey she had helped prepare. "Sarah," Arthur said. His voice was rough but clear. She looked at him. "Don't let them," he said, and then stopped, because whatever the sentence was going to contain had become too large for him to finish. "I know," she said. She covered his hand with hers. She did not tell him what she had seen 20 minutes earlier, just before the guests arrived, the thing she had not been meant to see. Tiffany and Elena at the far end of the dining room table, heads close together, a folded document passing between them under the table's edge. The way Elena's hand had moved it to Tiffany without looking down. The way Tiffany had slid it into the inside pocket of her jacket with the efficiency of a woman concluding a transaction. Sarah had caught only a glimpse. Enough to see the notarial seal at the bottom corner of the top page. Enough to understand, in a cold and immediate way, that whatever the document was, it was about the house, or the assets, or both, and it was moving in a direction that did not include her name. She sat with Arthur until the gathering in the dining room began to wind down. She listened to the voices and the chairs scraping back and the particular sounds of a house being handed from one group of people to another. Inch by inch, transaction by transaction, dressed up as family. "Do I even exist to you people?" she had whispered in the doorway of the dining room earlier in the evening, to no one in particular, or to everyone. But the champagne glasses had been clinking, and the business clients had been laughing at something. Tiffany said, and the sound had been absorbed by the room without leaving a mark. The turkey was dry. She had overcooked it slightly, which had never happened to her before with this bird in this oven in this kitchen. And she had not been able to correct it because she had been in the back bedroom taking care of the man who owned the house. She thought about that as she washed the dishes after everyone had gone home, her hands working through the hot water. The calluses, a second skin she no longer thought to resent. The humiliation of the evening sat in her chest like something swallowed wrong, not the sharp burn of fresh injury, but the dull familiar ache of something that had been true for a long time finally being said aloud in front of company. She stacked the last dish on the drying rack and turned off the kitchen light and stood for a moment in the dark. What she needed to decide was whether the document she had seen meant what she thought it meant. And if it did, what that made the last several years of her life. And if she had the will, still, after everything, to care. She was not ready to answer any of those questions tonight. But she was also no longer the kind of woman who could choose not to ask them. 15 years. Sarah sat with that number some mornings the way other people sat with their coffee, turning it in her hands. Feeling its weight, trying to understand how something that had been accumulating one day at a time had arrived, all at once, at a figure that large. She was 49 years old. She had been 26 when she married Daniel Miller in a small ceremony at a vineyard in Hunterdon County. Her mother crying in the front row, her father telling her afterward at the reception that Daniel was a good man, a steady man, the kind of man you built a life around. She had believed all of that. She had been the kind of 26-year-old who did believe things like that. Who approached the future with the particular confidence of someone who has not yet been taught what the future actually costs. The kitchen was dark when she sat in it these days. She had stopped turning on the overhead light in the evenings. It was one of those small, reasonless surrenders, the kind that tell you something is wrong before you're ready to admit what. She preferred the dim glow of the range hood, which cast a narrow column of light across the counter and left the rest of the room in shadow. It suited the hours she kept now, which were not the hours of a person living a life so much as the hours of a person maintaining one. Up at 6 for Arthur's morning medications. Bed, some nights, past midnight, because the bad nights had been coming more frequently these last few months, and the bad nights required her presence in a way that admitted no substitution. Daniel's last check had arrived 11 days late and had been $400 short of the agreed amount. She had not called him about it. She had made the mortgage payment out of the tutoring money instead, which left her account balance at a number. She had trained herself not to look at directly, the way you don't look directly at certain things that will only make the problem feel larger than you can manage. The foreclosure notice was on the table in front of her now. She had opened it that morning, in the full light of day, and read it twice. And then set it face down on the table and gone to check Arthur's blood pressure and refill his water pitcher and call the pharmacy about the prescription renewal, and done all of those things. With complete competence and no expression on her face, because that was what was required of her. And then she had come back to the kitchen in the evening with the range hood on and the rest of the house dark and picked up the notice and read it again. 3 months. Daniel had missed 3 mortgage payments. She had known the payments were late. She had not known how late. The distinction felt, in that moment, like the difference between being lost and not knowing how lost you were. Arthur's nights had become an archaeology of regret. He talked more now than he had in the early years after the accident. The enforced stillness had turned him inward, and what was inside was not the bitter endurance she might have expected from a man of his generation and disposition, but something more like grief, not for his mobility, though that was there too, but for the particular failures of fatherhood that had become impossible to ignore from a horizontal position. Tiffany used to follow me around the yard when she was little, he told Sarah one night in early November, his voice rough with tiredness. Like a shadow. Everywhere I went. He paused. I wonder where that went. Sarah smoothed the blanket across his chest. Things change, she said, which was not an answer but was the only thing she had that was both true and kind. You know what the worst part is? He looked at the ceiling rather than at her. I know what they're doing. I'm not senile. I see it all. His jaw worked. And I'm in this bed. She did not tell him about the foreclosure notice. She did not tell him about the document she had seen pass between Elena and Tiffany at Thanksgiving, which she had spent 3 months trying to verify and had not yet been able to. She did not tell him about Daniel's missing payments, or the tutoring money redirected to the mortgage, or the fact that her own back had started giving her serious trouble in the last 6 months, a disc problem. Her doctor had told her, brought on by the physical demands of long-term caregiving without proper support equipment. She had been putting off the MRI he recommended because the copay was not something she could fit into the current budget. She told him none of this because he was 78 years old and could not walk and was already carrying more than a man should have to carry. And because telling him would only transfer the weight without reducing it. You're a good person, Sarah, he said. You're my only real daughter. I mean that. She looked at his face, which was aged now in the way that faces age under sustained hardship. Not in the soft, gradual way of ordinary time but in the sharper way of specific suffering. He meant what he said. She believed that completely. It didn't help. She wanted it to help and it didn't, and she sat in the wing-backed chair beside his bed and held the hand that had once held hers at her wedding, when he had walked her down the aisle because her own father had passed the year before. And she felt the full dead weight of the years between that afternoon and this one. Elena found her in the kitchen at 2 in the morning. Sarah had not heard her come in. She had the silent walk of someone who had spent years moving through spaces without wanting to announce herself. And she appeared at the kitchen doorway in a housecoat with her hair loose, looking older than she usually did. Looking something closer to her actual age, which was 42 but had accumulated its own variety of hardship. He's asleep, Elena said. I checked. I know, Sarah said. I was just in there. Elena crossed to the counter and looked at the foreclosure notice without commenting on it. Then she looked at Sarah. Once he's gone, Elena said, and her voice was not unkind but it was direct in a way that left no room for the comfort of interpretation. You're out. The sisters and I have decided. Tiffany's name is on the power of attorney. It's done. Sarah stared at her. I'm telling you, Elena said, because I think you deserve to know. Not because I'm on your side. And then she poured herself a glass of water and walked back out of the kitchen. And Sarah heard her footsteps on the stairs, and then the house was quiet again. The range hood hummed. The foreclosure notice sat face up on the table in the pool of narrow light. Sarah's hands were folded in front of her on the table, and she looked at them. At the calluses, at the dry skin around her knuckles, at the faint indentation on her left ring finger from a ring she had stopped wearing 2 years ago because it caught on Arthur's sheets when she was changing them. I gave you my youth, Arthur. She thought it rather than said it, because saying it to a sleeping man in the next room was the kind of thing that crossed a line she had no intention of crossing. I gave you 15 years and my back and my marriage and whatever I might have become if I'd gone somewhere else. And now I have nothing to show for it but a bottle of Advil and a foreclosure notice. And a husband in Texas and a stepmother-in-law who just told me to start packing. She was not a woman who cried easily. She had trained that out of herself somewhere in the middle years, when she had understood that there was no one in this particular household who would respond to her tears with anything useful. She did not cry now. She sat in the dark kitchen with the notice on the table and her ruined hands folded on top of each other. And she understood with perfect clarity that she had arrived at the bottom of something. Not a low point. The bottom. The place where there was no further to fall. The understanding was terrible. It was also, in a very small and unexpected way, clarifying. At 49, Sarah Miller had learned that certain kinds of pain, when they have gone as deep as they can go, stop being pain and start being information. She looked at the foreclosure notice for a long time. Then she filed it in the folder she kept in the cabinet above the refrigerator. Beside all the Medicare documents and the insurance statements and the years of paperwork she had been accumulating without knowing exactly why. She turned off the range hood. She went to bed. She did not sleep for a long time, but when sleep finally came, it was the deep, dreamless kind, the sleep of a person who has made a decision without yet knowing what the decision is. Friends, thank you for staying with Sarah's story this far. In just 4 sequences, we've watched a woman give 15 of her best years to a family that treated her sacrifice as something they were simply owed. We've seen her husband leave, her back break down, and her bank account empty out, and through all of it, she kept showing up. She changed the sheets, she filled the pill organizer, she sat in the dark kitchen alone with a foreclosure notice and did not fall apart. But we've also seen something else. A document passed under a table. A stepmother who told her the truth without pretending it was kindness. A dying man who called her his only real daughter. And a woman who, somewhere in the exhausted stillness of 2 in the morning, stopped falling and started landing. What happens now that Sarah has hit the bottom? What was really in that USB drive, and what did Arthur record when the family thought he couldn't remember his own name? Stay with us. The second half of Sarah's story is where the reckoning begins. There is a particular quality to memory when it returns unbidden, not the soft, nostalgic kind that arrives with a familiar smell or a song on the radio, but the other kind. The kind that surfaces in the middle of an ordinary task and demands to be looked at with new eyes. The kind that has been waiting in the archive of everything you filed away as unimportant, patient as a deposition, until the moment arrives when you are finally ready to understand what it was saying all along. It came to Sarah on a gray December afternoon, 14 years back. Not now. The now of the kitchen and the foreclosure notice had dissolved into sleep. And then into morning, and then into the necessary forward motion of the days. But her mind, in the way of minds that have been storing things without instruction, went back. She had been on the back porch of Cedar Lane, pulling the dead summer annuals from the window boxes because it was that time of year and nobody else was going to do it. Arthur had been inside napping. Elena had been in the garden, the small, somewhat neglected rectangle behind the detached garage that Arthur's wife had maintained faithfully and that had been going wild since the funeral. Sarah had been aware of Elena out there the way she was aware of most things in that house, peripherally, catalogued but not engaged with. She had been pulling at the dead roots when she heard the sound. Not crying, exactly. Something quieter than crying. The sound a person makes when they are attempting, with only partial success, to contain something that has gotten larger than containment. She had stopped pulling at the roots. Through the gap in the fence boards she could see Elena crouched in the garden, her back to the house. Her shoulders doing the particular small trembling that accompanies that specific variety of almost silence. And on her forearm, visible from that angle, a bruise that had the coloration of something a week old, yellowish at the edges, darker at the center. The kind that came from a grip rather than a fall. Sarah had looked at the bruise for a moment. Then she had gone back to the window box. She had filed it the way she filed things. She was not ready to interpret quietly, without comment, in the long catalogue of things she understood without understanding. Later, much later, the December night of the foreclosure notice still working through her, she remembered something else from that same period. Arthur, at the kitchen table, writing a check. She had come in for water and he had covered the check with his forearm in the reflexive way of someone who considers their private business to be private. But she had caught the name on the payee line. A collection agency. The amount had been in 4 figures. She had not connected it to anything at the time. It was Arthur's money and Arthur's affairs, and she had poured her water and gone back to her tutoring prep and thought no more about it. But now, sorting through the accumulated images of 14 years the way she sorted through the household files, patient, methodical, looking for the connections that only become visible in retrospect, she began to see the shape of something. Arthur paying off a debt that was not his own. Elena hiding a bruise in a garden. A Social Security survivor benefit notice she had seen once on the kitchen counter and not been meant to see from Elena's first marriage. A small monthly figure, with Elena's signature at the bottom of a waiver form. She had waived it, given up a benefit she was entitled to, at a time when she was clearly struggling. Why would a woman who married an older man for money waive income she was entitled to? Sarah sat with that question. The story she had been told about Elena, the story Tiffany had constructed and repeated until it had the weight of established fact, was the story of a gold digger. A younger woman latching on to a grieving widower 6 months after his wife's funeral, calculating the inheritance, working the angle. It was a story with a clean shape and a clear villain, and it had been very convenient for everyone who needed it to be true. But Sarah thought about the trembling hands at the pill organizer. About the way Elena had stayed when the accident happened, when the calculation, if there had been one, would have said to leave. About the voice on the phone from Morristown Medical Center, the control in it, the cost of that control. About the bruise on the forearm. The waived benefit. The debt paid in secret. We were both trapped in the same cage, Sarah thought. I just thought she held the key. She didn't know yet if this was true. She was not, at 49, the kind of woman who revised a 15-year understanding of a person on the basis of a reread of the evidence. She had been wrong before, and being wrong was expensive. But she was also no longer the kind of woman who could look at the evidence and refuse to consider what it might be saying. Somewhere outside, the winter wind moved through the bare trees on Cedar Lane, and the house settled around her with the particular sounds of old wood and old pipes. And Sarah Miller sat in the stillness of her 15th year in this house and allowed herself, for the first time, to wonder whether the woman she had believed to be her enemy had been something else entirely, something more complicated, more costly, more carefully played. The question opened into the dark like a door she hadn't known was there. She did not step through it yet. But she did not close it, either. Arthur Miller died on a Wednesday morning in late February, when the light through the bedroom window was the particular thin gray of early dawn, and the furnace had been running all night. And the house smelled like it always smelled on mornings when the season hadn't fully committed to anything yet, like cold ground and old wood and the faint residue of the eucalyptus oil Sarah put in the humidifier to help with his breathing. She had been in the chair beside his bed. She had not planned to fall asleep there, but somewhere around 3 in the morning. Her body had made the decision without consulting her, and she had woken with a start at 6:15 to the particular stillness of a room from which something essential had just departed. His face was relaxed in a way it hadn't been in years. His hands, folded on the blanket the way she had folded them the previous evening, were still. She sat with him for a while before she called anyone. She was not sure, afterward, how long that while was. Long enough for the light to change. Long enough for the full weight of what 15 years had been building toward to settle around her shoulders and simply rest there, heavy. But clean, the way the end of a very long effort feels, not like relief, exactly, but like the particular quiet that comes after sustained noise. She called the hospice nurse first. Then Elena. Then, after a moment, Daniel. Daniel cried on the phone, which surprised her. She had not expected that, and she was not sure how to feel about it. And so she held the phone and let him cry and said the appropriate things in the appropriate tone, and when he said he would book a flight she said yes, of course, and hung up. The funeral was 3 days later. Tiffany had arranged it with the efficiency of a woman who had been arranging it in her head for some time. And it showed: the casket was selected, the caterer contracted, the obituary drafted, all within 24 hours of Arthur's death. The efficiency was not, Sarah noted, the efficiency of grief. It was the efficiency of a woman who had been waiting for a starting gun to fire. The service was held at a funeral home on Route 202 that Sarah had never been to before. The room was beige and carpeted and smelled of lilies and the particular industrial neutrality of spaces designed to absorb sadness without retaining it. Tiffany stood at the front greeting people with the practiced sobriety of a host rather than a daughter. Brooke sat in the front row and cried with the volume of a woman who wanted the room to know she was crying. Daniel arrived from the airport 40 minutes before the service and sat beside Sarah and held her hand once, briefly, before releasing it. Elena stood at the back of the room alone, in a gray dress, and said almost nothing to anyone. Sarah watched her. There was a reception at the house afterward, more of Tiffany's efficiency, and Sarah moved through it like a woman doing the job she had always done, collecting cups, refilling plates, performing the domestic competence that had made her invisible for 15 years. Tiffany circulated among the guests, discussing the estate with the subtlety of someone who had decided subtlety was an inefficiency they could no longer afford. Sarah was in the kitchen alone, running water over her hands, when she heard the back door open. Elena came in. She was still in the gray dress. She closed the door behind her and stood for a moment, as if establishing that she was real, that this was actually happening, that the decade and a half of performance was over and she could put it down now. "Come outside," Elena said. "I need to show you something away from this house." They sat in Elena's car in the driveway, not going anywhere, just away from the windows and the voices inside. Elena reached into her purse and placed 2 things on the center console between them. The first was a USB drive. Small, black, the kind you could buy at any Walgreens. The second was a document that ran to 7 pages, the last page bearing a notarial seal and 2 signatures. Arthur Miller's, in the shaky but deliberate hand of the last 2 years, and a witness Sarah did not recognize. "Read the cover page," Elena said. Sarah picked it up. "Last will and testament of Arthur James Miller. Recorded and notarized on the following date, in the presence of the following witnesses, to supersede all previous documents." He recorded it on video, Elena said. Clear-eyed, on his good days, over 3 sessions. "I have a copy of the video on the drive. So does his attorney Harold Simmons in Flemington. So does his accountant." Sarah turned the pages. She did not read every word. She would read every word later, twice, with a legal dictionary open on her phone, but she read enough. "You let me hate you for 15 years just to save me?" Sarah's voice came out different from how she had expected, not controlled, not level. Cracked, like something that had been held under pressure for a long time and finally found the surface. "I didn't let you hate me," Elena said. And there was no self-pity in her voice and no apology, just the steady tone of someone delivering a long overdue account. "I couldn't tell you. If the sisters suspected you knew, they would have pushed Arthur to change everything. They needed to believe I was with them. And they needed to believe you were out of the picture. The power of attorney document at Thanksgiving." "A fake," Elena said. "Tiffany had a real attorney draft a real document, but Arthur never signed it. He signed something else that day. I told him what Tiffany was going to bring. He'd already been working with Simmons for 6 months by then." Sarah sat with this. The car was cold. Elena hadn't run the engine and the sounds of the reception inside the house came to them muffled through the wall. The particular sound of people celebrating something they didn't know they'd lost yet. "Every dollar Tiffany took from the catering business," Elena continued, "was documented. I made sure of it. Every invoice she inflated, every rebate she pocketed, every cash withdrawal she logged as an operating expense. I kept copies. Simmons has copies. Why? Sarah asked. Why all of this? Why didn't you tell me? Elena looked at the windshield for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter. Because Arthur asked me to. He said you were the one person in his life who had never asked him for anything. He didn't want to put the weight of this on you. He wanted you to just be able to care for him. She paused. And because if I had told you, and you had changed how you acted around the sisters even slightly, they would have known. They're not smart, but they're watchful. You would have given it away. Sarah thought about 15 years of not knowing. About the nights in the dark kitchen. About the foreclosure notice. About the way she had said you let me hate you as if it were an accusation. Rather than an expression of the particular grief that comes with discovering you were protected by someone you thought was your enemy. The foreclosure, Sarah said. Simmons is aware, Elena said. Once the will is filed, the house becomes your asset. The mortgage is resolvable. Sarah looked at the USB drive on the console between them. Then at the 7 pages in her hands. Then through the windshield at the bare February trees and the gray New Jersey sky and the house on Cedar Lane. Which was full right now of people who were celebrating something that had already slipped entirely through their fingers. She did not cry. She thought she might, and she waited for it, and it didn't come, not now, not in this cold car. With these documents in her hands and Elena sitting beside her with the stillness of someone who has been carrying a very long performance to its final scene. What came instead was something cleaner than tears. Something that felt, in the hollow of her chest where 15 years of accumulated weight had been living, like wind. The cold New Jersey wind that came in off the February fields. Clean, empty, the kind of air that means the start of something rather than the end. For the first time in longer than she could precisely calculate, Sarah Miller breathed it in. The reading of the will was scheduled for a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after Arthur's funeral, in the Flemington offices of Harold Simmons, attorney at law. The office was on the second floor of a converted Victorian on Main Street. Accessed by a staircase that creaked in a way that suggested it had been built in a century that didn't expect to still be in use. And the waiting room had bookshelves and a carpet with a faded floral pattern and the specific atmosphere of a place where serious things were conducted without pretension. Tiffany arrived early. This, Sarah had expected. Tiffany was the kind of woman who arrived early to things she intended to control. And she had spent the 3 weeks since the funeral operating under the assumption that what was happening today was a formality, the legal ratification of an arrangement that had already been decided. She had mentioned to Brooke, at the reception, in a voice not quite quiet enough, that she was planning to list the Cedar Lane property with a colleague in February. She had mentioned a number. The number was close to market. She was wearing a blazer. She had brought a folder. Brooke was beside her in the waiting room when Sarah came in. Brooke, who had spent the reception telling stories about Arthur's youth that she had learned secondhand and presented as memories. Brooke, who had not visited Cedar Lane more than twice in the last 5 years. Brooke, who had called Sarah the unpaid help in front of company and never mentioned it again. They looked at Sarah when she entered. Tiffany's expression adjusted a small recalibration, the look of someone revising a minor calculation without believing it will change the outcome. Sarah sat down across from them. She had her own folder. She had reviewed every page of the will the previous night, with a legal dictionary and 2 cups of chamomile tea, and she had called Harold Simmons' office that morning to confirm the video recording would be available for playback. Elena came in last, 2 minutes before the scheduled time, in a black coat. With the particular composure of a woman who has finished something difficult and is prepared for what comes next. Harold Simmons was in his late 60s, with the measured manner of a man who had conducted a great many of these appointments. And had learned that the most important skill, in the room where a dead person's wishes were given legal force, was the ability to remain entirely neutral while the living sorted out their shock. He opened the proceedings with the standard language: date of document, identification of parties, attestation to Arthur Miller's capacity at the time of signing. Confirmed by the neurologist who had examined him at Harold's request 6 weeks before the recording. He read this last part carefully and clearly, looking up once to make sure everyone in the room understood what he was establishing. Tiffany's jaw set slightly. Then Harold turned to his laptop and turned the screen toward the room. Arthur was in his bedroom, Sarah's chair pulled close to the bedside table. A lamp on because the winter light was low, and he was wearing the blue flannel shirt Sarah had given him 2 Christmases ago. He looked directly at the camera. His eyes, in the recording, were clear. Whatever the disease had taken from him, it had not, on that day, taken his clarity, and the room became very quiet in the particular way that happens when everyone present understands simultaneously that a dead man is speaking to them with full possession of his intentions. "I'm making this record," Arthur said, on the screen, in the voice Sarah recognized from 10,000 ordinary mornings in that house, "because I know my family. I love my daughters. But love doesn't make people honest, and I have not been blind." A pause. He adjusted slightly in the bed. "Tiffany and Brooke have not visited this house more than a handful of times in the last decade. They have benefited from a family business built on my settlement money. I know what was taken. I know the amounts. I know the invoices. Elena has given me the documentation, and it has been filed with this will." Tiffany's color changed. It was not a gradual change but a sudden one, the kind that happens when a system fails rather than declines. "Daniel has been absent," Arthur continued, "in the ways that count most. He made his choice, and I have made mine." He looked at the camera again, straight on. "Sarah Miller has been in this house for 15 years. She has made my meals, managed my medications, sat with me through the bad nights, and never once made me feel like a burden. She has received nothing for this except a failing marriage and a house that was going to foreclosure. A breath. She gets 80% of the estate. The house, the remaining investments, and the proceeds of any settlement. Elena has declined her own share by her own choice, and I have honored that. Tiffany and Brooke received 10% each, minus the documented amounts taken from the business, which have been calculated by my accountant and are attached to this will as Exhibit C." He reached toward the camera slowly, and the recording ended. The room was quiet for a long moment after Harold closed the laptop. Tiffany was the first to speak. "That recording is invalid," she said, and her voice had a controlled quality that cost her something visibly. "He wasn't competent. He was on pain medication. We'll contest it. The neurologist's assessment is part of the record," Harold said, without inflection. "Dr. Patricia Nguyen of Morristown Medical. She is prepared to testify to his capacity on the days of recording. We'll contest the neurologist. That is your right." Elena opened her bag. She placed a manila envelope on Harold's desk without ceremony. "Business fraud documentation," she said. "All 3 years. Invoices, withdrawal records, rebate payments to a personal account. Exhibit C is the summary. The originals are in that envelope." Brooke had gone very still. The folder Tiffany had brought, the one with the listing details. The one for the house sale that was already planned, was sitting on the table beside her untouched, and Sarah watched Tiffany's hand move toward it once and then stop, as if she had remembered that the document inside it was now a piece of evidence in a story that had gone completely wrong. Harold's assistant entered from the back office and served the bank freezing notice directly to Tiffany's attorney, who had arrived 30 minutes earlier and was now reading it at the corner of the table with an expression of professional neutrality that took visible effort. Sarah watched Tiffany's face go through its sequence, the controlled fury, and then the calculation beneath it, and then the moment when the calculation arrived at its result. And the result was not what the calculation had been built to produce. The color had not returned. Her hands, on the table, were still. It was the sound of the preceding closing, Harold gathering his papers, the assistant's quiet footsteps, the creak of the Victorian building around them, that Sarah's mind went, just for a moment, to the kitchen on Cedar Lane, to the range hood's narrow light, to the foreclosure notice on the table at 2 in the morning, face up in the silence. The law, she thought, had just seen what love had failed to protect. Not because love was insufficient, but because love alone, without documentation, without a clear-eyed man in a blue flannel shirt, looking directly into a camera on one of his good days, was not enough to hold against people who knew how to use paperwork. Daniel, who had flown in the previous day and was sitting at the far end of the table, had not said a word since the recording ended. He was looking at the table surface with the expression of a man receiving a series of recognitions that arrived too late to be of any use. Sarah did not look at him long. After the meeting concluded and Tiffany had left with her attorney, speaking in low rapid sentences about next steps and timelines and challenges, Sarah stood in the hallway outside Harold Simmons' office and looked out the tall Victorian window at Main Street below. The February trees along the street were bare, and a thin cold sun was working on the icy patches of sidewalk, an ordinary Tuesday morning. Life was happening down there, people parking, a delivery truck blocking the corner, a woman walking a dog that kept stopping to smell every fire hydrant with the focused enthusiasm of someone who has nowhere to be and finds everything interesting. She heard the gavel, or rather, she heard the closing of Harold Simmons' door, which had a similar quality. A sound that meant something was done. Something that could not be undone. It was the first beautiful sound she had heard in years. She sold the house in April. Not immediately, there was the estate process first. The legal calendar that runs on its own schedule regardless of how urgently the living want to be done with the past. There were weeks of paperwork and phone calls with Harold Simmons and 2 conversations with an estate accountant, whose name she kept forgetting and had to look up each time. There were the documentation filings related to the business fraud, which moved through the appropriate channels with the unhurried inevitability of processes that have everything they need to proceed. Tiffany's attorney filed the contest, as promised, and then withdrew it 6 weeks later when Patricia Nguyen's written assessment arrived and the account records Elena had assembled proved more comprehensive than the sister's side had anticipated. Sarah received a call from Harold Simmons on a Thursday afternoon in late March. She was in the Hoboken apartment she had rented, a 1-bedroom on the 4th floor with a window that faced east, which she had chosen specifically for the morning light, sitting at the kitchen table with a student's practice essay and a red pen. "It's done," Harold said. She set the red pen down. "The contest has been withdrawn. Exhibit C has been filed with the county. The business accounts are frozen pending resolution. The Cedar Lane property title transfers to you on Tuesday." She looked at the window. The light was doing the thing it did on good mornings, that particular New Jersey spring quality pale, but committed, the light of a season that has decided to proceed. "Thank you," she said. "Ms. Miller," Harold said, in the tone of a man who spent his professional life in rooms where things ended. It was straightforward. Once the recording was verified and the documentation filed, there was nothing to challenge. "Your father-in-law was quite thorough." She thanked him again and hung up and sat for a moment with her hands in her lap and the spring light on the table in front of her. Arthur had been thorough. He had planned it across 6 months, in the room where she thought she was caring for him, while the rest of the family thought his mind was going. He had been clear on his good days, and on his good days. He had been working with Harold, with Elena, with the quiet determination of a man who knew what he owed and intended to pay it in the only currency left to him. She thought of him in the blue flannel shirt, looking directly at the camera. She gets 80%. She picked the red pen back up. She finished the essay. She drove to Cape May on a Saturday in early May. Elena had given her the address, a small cottage 3 blocks from the water. One of those narrow Cape May houses with a covered porch and old roses climbing the front fence that hadn't been trimmed in a year and clearly didn't need to be. The town was not yet in its summer mode. The streets were quiet, and the shops along Washington Street were in the process of opening for the season, and the light off the water had the clean, direct quality of early spring at the shore, uncomplicated by the heat that would come later. Elena answered the door in an apron. She had been cooking. Apparently the cottage smelled like garlic and something with tomatoes, the kind of effortful, purposeful cooking that fills a space. She looked different here than she had in Cedar Lane. Lighter was not quite the right word, but it was close. Like a person whose posture had adjusted now that a specific weight had been set down. They sat on the porch for a while, in the old painted chairs that had come with the rental, with mugs of coffee and the sound of the street and the distant irregular sound of the ocean 2 blocks away. "You didn't take anything," Sarah said. Not accusing, observing. "I have what I need," Elena said. "I have more than I expected to have, actually." "You could have." "I was in Arthur's life for 10 years, Elena said. "I'm not interested in carrying it into the next part of mine. I have savings. I have this." She looked at the roses on the fence. And I don't have Tiffany calling me twice a day. Sarah smiled at that. It was the particular smile of a woman who had not smiled at something in a long time and was relearning the muscle. He knew, Sarah said, that I would come out all right. He knew, Elena agreed. They sat with that for a moment. Sarah had, over the previous weeks, worked through the anger at Elena not in a single conversation, but in the slow way real reconsideration happens, incrementally, in the space between the last thing you believed and the next thing you're willing to consider. She had not arrived at something uncomplicated. What Elena had done had cost Sarah real things: 15 years of believing herself entirely alone. Of feeling the full weight of that solitude without the anchor of knowing that someone, somewhere, was playing a long game on her behalf. That cost was real and she did not minimize it. But she also understood, now, that Elena had been in her own cage, the cage of a woman with a past full of debt and damage, who had found in Arthur not a meal ticket but a version of safety she hadn't known how to find elsewhere. Who had repaid that safety in the only way she knew how: by protecting him, and by extension, protecting the woman who had given him his dignity for 15 years. It was complicated. Real things usually were. I opened college funds, Sarah said. For the kids. Elena nodded. And I'm going back to teaching. Full-time. I had an interview at the middle school in Weehawken last week. She paused. I haven't taught full-time since before Arthur's accident. How did the interview go? They offered me the position before I left the building. She said it without particular pride, just fact, the fact of a competence she'd always had that had simply been applied, for 15 years, in a direction nobody had been watching. She had signed the new apartment lease the previous week. Her own name at the top. Her own credit, which was battered but not broken. The pen in her hand had been the ordinary kind of ballpoint, blue ink, and her hands, resting on the lease form, had the calluses she had stopped thinking to resent. Roughened from years of work that deserved to leave a mark. She had signed her name slowly and clearly and felt, as she lifted the pen, something that was not quite relief and not quite triumph but occupied the territory between them. Something that meant, this is mine. Not a house she was maintaining for someone else. Not a marriage she was holding together through proximity and habit. Hers. A door she would lock and unlock herself. A window with morning light she had specifically chosen. At 50, Sarah Miller understood some things she had not known at 35. She understood that sacrifice, performed in silence, in the absence of witnesses, leaves no record unless someone has the foresight to create one. That the people who take the most are rarely the ones who document the taking. That the law can be a form of justice, but only when someone has been patient enough to build the case over time. She understood that caregiving is labor. That love, however genuine, does not pay a mortgage. That a woman who gives 15 years of her back and her sleep and her professional life to the dignity of a dying man is not a saint. She is a worker who was never compensated, and that distinction matters enormously. She understood that it is possible to be saved by someone you spent 15 years misreading. That this is not a failure of perception so much as a consequence of the conditions, and that the grace in it, if there is grace, is in being willing to look at the evidence again when the evidence changes. And she understood this was the one that had taken the longest. The one that she was still in the process of understanding, that starting over at 50 was not a diminishment. It was not the consolation prize for a life that had gone wrong. It was the life itself, beginning from a different place than expected, with more information than she had at 26 and considerably more scar tissue. And that the combination of those two things was not a deficit. It was something else entirely. Something she did not have a single word for yet. She was in no hurry to find one. She had time. That morning, the morning after she had signed the lease, the first morning in the east-facing apartment, she had woken before her alarm. The room was quiet. The light was coming in at the angle she had calculated when she chose the apartment, falling across the floor in a long pale rectangle that moved as she watched it. She lay still for a while in the stillness of a room that smelled only of itself. No eucalyptus oil in the humidifier. No medications to count. No sounds of a house that needed her before she was ready. The only person who needed anything, in that room, on that morning, was her. She got up and made coffee and stood at the east window with the mug warm between her calloused hands, and watched the light come the rest of the way in. For the first time in 15 years, the morning asked nothing of her. And she understood, standing there in the clear spring light at 50 years old, that this particular nothing, this unclaimed morning, was what she had been working toward all along. It had taken longer than it should have. It had cost more than it should have cost. But here it was, hers. Friends, how did you find Sarah's story today? I've been sitting with it since the final scene, that image of her at the window, coffee in hand, the morning asking nothing of her. After 15 years of being the person everyone leaned on and nobody saw, she finally had a morning that belonged entirely to herself. I don't know about you, but that landed somewhere deep. What strikes me most about Sarah's journey is not the courtroom, as satisfying as that was. It's the 15 years before it. The dishes she washed, the pills she sorted, the foreclosure notice she read alone at 2 in the morning and then filed away because that was the kind of woman she was. She didn't crumble, she didn't leave, she kept showing up in that cold house, in that dark kitchen, for a family that had decided she was furniture. And here's what the story taught me: sacrifice performed in silence leaves no record unless someone is paying attention. Arthur was paying attention. Elena, in her complicated and costly way, was paying attention. And in the end, the truth didn't need to be loud. It just needed a notarial seal and a man in a blue flannel shirt who still had his good days. We all face moments where we wonder whether what we've given has been worth it. Whether the years we've poured into something, a family, a marriage, a person who needed us, will ever be acknowledged. Sarah's story doesn't promise that the acknowledgement always comes in time. But it does say this: keep your records. Keep your evidence. Keep showing up, not because you expect to be seen, but because integrity is the one thing that cannot be taken from you. And sometimes the people you thought weren't watching have been watching all along. I hope this story brought you something today. A little fire, a little comfort, a little of the quiet satisfaction of watching the truth finally arrive where it belongs. If it did, please subscribe, and hit that like button. Good stories like Sarah's deserve to be heard by as many ears as possible. And I'll be here, with the next one, whenever you're ready.